Hi, Psychology 211. This is Beth Nicopolis, your instructor, reporting from Northlake College today. I wanted to talk a little bit about Chapter 4, the Multicultural Society. This is a concept that probably many of you have heard of before, but a multicultural society really celebrates diversity and differences among ethnic, racial, and religious cultures. Many of you have been asked the question before, where are you from? How do you answer that question? Most people answer that question, where am I from based on the place they were born. Usually the country they were born, maybe the state, or maybe even the county that they were born. But if you're from a different culture, like one of our authors, you'll see that it's a little bit challenging. Our author has an accent, obviously. She was born and raised in another country. And so people will often ask her, where are you from? And they want to hear, I'm from Greece. But if you're like our author, well, she was born and raised in Greece, she really is an American and certainly feels like one. And so that's a good question to think about. How do people see you? How do they identify you? Versus how do you feel about yourself? People associate the I's and the me's where they're from the places they were born, but also based on their religion, their ethnic backgrounds, their heritage. Those things are important in how you see yourself in an ethnic way. You know from last discussion that I happen to be half Greek. I don't really tell most people that way, but my name makes it kind of obvious that there's something Greek about me. And so a lot of times people will ask, are you Greek? Or is that your married name and your husband's Greek? And I'll say, well, yes, my husband is Greek, but so am I. They look at me and don't necessarily think a blonde, she's Greek. But how I identify myself sometimes, if I'm with people that are like me, a lot of Greek people, then I feel a whole lot more Greek necessarily than I do just when I'm sitting here talking to somebody. So how you identify yourself racially is about your ethnic identity. And while we assign or ascribe people racial identity, that is a very personal thing as well. So we carry that as a social identity. And the question that you'll find from this week's YouTube videos especially is, what does that mean in a country like the United States, where we have so many different cultures in one, where we have such a large influx of immigrants from many countries, in particular Spanish-speaking countries. What does that mean for our own identity? And our book talks about increasing immigration and flow of refugees as, to some degree, creating an identity crisis for the country. And I think that's one of the things that you see in the video, that the last video, which I think is kind of difficult, at least it was for me to watch. It was a very informative video, in particular about the history of immigration in this country. But what you find towards the end is the speaker talks about the United States losing its identity, that as European, white European Americans, that we will soon be the minority, and we don't want that to happen. And so he kind of speaks to that identity crisis and what it feels like to be that majority that's soon to become the minority. So I really thought that was a good video. It certainly challenged me to think a little bit more about what it means to be an American. In a multicultural society, groups organize themselves based on political, economic, educational, moral goals, sometimes religious goals as well. We tend to find the groups that are similar to us. Either they look like us or they have the same values as we do, and that may be how we tie to different groups. So it's based on our perception of ourselves and those social links that we might pick up. A multicultural society really stands for the acknowledgement of variation, so that it's a good thing to have different cultures, and the variation amongst a country such as the United States is a great thing, and that it should be celebrated. So most people would say multiculturalism and a multicultural society is really a good thing. Multicultural societies also believe that every segment of that society, ethnic, racial, religious, religiously should be equal, and they are treated the same, and they should have the same rights as the majority culture does. And they even have a practice of seeking justice, if you will, or as the book calls it, cultural parity, for those groups that are vulnerable or marginalized. And you hear the word marginalized a lot in our book, and you'll probably hear it if you watch the media as well. And that would be groups really that don't have a voice. Maybe are immigrants in this country, for example, are undocumented aliens, for example, may not have a voice. Children are vulnerable and can't speak for themselves. The elderly, the disabled. So that in a multicultural society, to those societies, it's important to help those groups so that their voices can be heard as well. Last week we talked about the concept of assimilation. And assimilation, while not necessarily opposite, is a different viewpoint. Assimilation says that when you come to this country, or you're a culture in this country, that you merge with the dominant culture. And in doing so, you become more like that culture, but you lose some of your own customs and ethnic roots that may or may not be important to you. And so from 1900 to World War II, that was sort of an important thing to do. That melting pot meant giving up some of your own culture to become part of the American culture. And as you saw with my grandmother and my mother-in-law, that was important to them, to be more American and maybe a little less Greek, or from wherever you came. When you assimilate, though, you give up some of that culture, or some of the ways that you might identify. And the assimilationist, I can't even say the word, I apologize, culture really rejects native customs. And so some of those things are sort of lost in the process. And again, sort of as a contrast to that, our textbook talks about pluralism. And pluralism really holds that ethnic and racial differences should thrive, and that, again, celebrated, and that they are an important part of the culture at large. But pluralism also holds that those ethnic and racial differences should thrive as long as they don't threaten the dominant values of that culture. One could argue that maybe that's part of what's happening in this country. So if this country was founded on white European Protestant values, for example, things such as gay marriage would be very difficult, or maybe cause some issues, as we see in Kentucky with the county clerk who refused to issue marriage licenses to gay couples. In her mind, that's something that is against her religious values. So as a culture, how do we allow, in that multicultural society, how do we allow those different cultures to thrive and to have equal justice and rights, and still manage to sort of make those work with our own values and pre-existing culture? It's a challenge, and it's one that we'll probably continue to have. And as you saw in our video, how does a country like the United States, founded by white Europeans, shifting to a majority Hispanic, what do we do about that? Is that acceptable? How do we accept those challenges? How do we reconcile those differences and still have an identity as the United States? That's a question to ask yourself. We've talked about identity many times. If I were in Europe and somebody asked me where you're from, I'd say the United States. But that's such a loaded question. What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be from the U.S.? So how you identify yourself politically are the constructs that you ascribe to yourself. And it's shared by people that are in those same groups as you. And in this case, it would be American. So for yourself, reflect on what it means to be American for you. Maybe if it's a Texan, what groups do you identify? And what is your own ethnic and racial identity? The next chapter will actually move into ethnicity, and will continue to have you ask that question of yourself. What does it mean to you? Who are you? And how do you identify yourself? Until next time, for chapter 2, Thank you.